In the last video I made, I had some speculation on what I thought would be a big sticking point for the Monster Hunter community when it came to Monster Hunter Wilds. I mean, what would be the big point of contention, the big argument, the pineapple on your pizza of the game? You know, the big controversial topic for endless lukewarm takes, like the Clutch Claw was for Icewind. And I don't mean to diminish any arguments about the Clutch Claw. I know it was very divisive, and that's my point. What was going to be the divisive thing? Like I said in that other video, I'm thinking it will be the wound system, and specifically how certain weapons are designed to monopolize them at the expense of other players' weapons. Bow and insect glaive, for example. I am anticipating a lot of discussion about that and probably some, weapon main infighting, which is always a little bit of fun so long as people don't take it too serious, you know what I mean? However, there's another hot button topic that will, very soon now I think, be the debate du jour, at least for a couple of weeks before and then after launch, because I'm anticipating we will soon know the extent of the full roster of monsters. And that will be the question of variety, the question of size. So prepare yourself for possibly endless YouTube videos and Reddit threads and Blue Sky posts asking, why are there so few monsters in Monster Hunter Wilds? Older games had way more monsters. And also possibly the closely related question, this monster roster sucks. Why is the monster list so bad? Hello again, I am Blunty, and like a very large chunk of the modern player base and fandom for Monster Hunter, I onboarded with World, and that means I've seen the community argue about exactly this stuff, about how many monsters are arriving, about how good or bad the roster is, no less than 4 times now. 2 for each base game release since, and then twice more for the Master Rank expansions. I am less clear on how this sort of stuff was talked about before the 5th gen, but I imagine it's pretty cyclical. Old schoolers, please let me know in the down below how it all went down back in the day. With Wilds, as I record this, we are still 38 days away from launch, and we do not yet know the full extent of the roster officially. There is some data mining of the previous beta that has taken place that has convinced some they know the exact size and content of the whole monster roster. I won't be talking about that today, and in general I have personally avoided looking at the data mining chat to myself, although I have seen a couple of things incidentally. But that does not include unannounced monsters and the size of the final roster and things like that. But officially revealed right now, we know of 17 monsters by my account. Correct me if I'm wrong or if I missed something here, but I'm pretty sure we're at 17. We've got Arkveld, Rompopolo, Ajurakan, Uthduna, Malabarina, Raydal, Balahara, Chemetris, Doshaguma, Chedakabra, Gypserus, Rathalos, Rathian, Gravios, Yankutku, the Black Flame, and Kongolala. And yes, the temptation to put the Poker Rap backing track behind that was high. You are welcome for my restraint. But my guess is that's a little over half of the final roster for launch, because I'm anticipating, I'm guessing, about 32 monsters on day one, let's say. Why 32? No scientific reason, it's a number I pulled out of my bum. It just sounds like a good number, 32. And it's in the ballpark of recent examples too, a little bit smaller than the previous 2 games' initial launches. But going all the way back, the first game had 17 large monsters. From there on in, if we just look at the first game of any new generation, which of course Wilds is, the start of the 6th generation, the 2nd generation Monster Hunter game started with 25 monsters, many of them returning. And we'll talk about why that is important in just a minute. The 3rd generation had 18 monsters at its start. The 4th generation had 52. And Monster Hunter World at the start of the 5th generation had 30. And Rise had 35-ish. Rise's launch roster gets a bit wibbly, depending on how you want to count it, because the game infamously launched incomplete due to the challenges around the global COVID epidemic, and only saw its full intended launch roster form in an update after launch. And throughout their first year, both World and Rise saw title updates that brought in new monsters too, inflating the pre-existing roster. Both World and Rise saw a lot of chatter and arguing in the community about the size and composition of the roster of large monsters at their launches. Complaints that it was too small, complaints about which monsters were there, which weren't, and whatever new monsters were introduced and whether or not they were good or bad. But one of the big reasons both World and Rise had comparatively small launch rosters compared to some of their immediate predecessors was simply the fact that they were properly ground up new Monster Hunter games. It's generally known that the Monster Hunter development happens over two teams of devs. There's crossover personnel, but for the most part it's two teams. The fandom generally refers to them as the mainline team and the portable team, although it's important to note this is not a distinction Capcom themselves make. For example, the director of Rise refers to it as a mainline game even though it's from the quote-unquote portable team. So it's a mistake to think that the teams are just separate, doing their own thing. There's plenty of overlap and they frequently collaborate on ideas and executions and build on each other's work. But in broad terms, you can think about it as, two teams. The mainline team who did World are also doing Wilds. And with World, they basically had to ground up, rebuild Monster Hunter as a game. While a lot of the previous generations of games shared a lot of material, textures, animation rigs, and skeletons, behavior sets and the like, World, just by its very nature and approach, had to rebuild and reinvent a bunch of stuff. And that's a lot of work to do. So they wound up focusing on implementing a smaller roster of monsters so they could give them the next-gen attention that they needed. A similar thing happened to Rise because of its nature. The large generation and generational power the Switch had versus the 3DS predecessor for the portable titles, and the game's thematic gimmicks such as the wire bug, made simply reusing old monster rigs and assets and textures and behaviors and animations wasn't going to work at all. But at this point you'd been excused for thinking, well, Wilds is basically Monster Hunter World 2. Surely they don't need to reinvent the wheel again, and that means we can have a larger roster this time. Well, it seems not. Firstly, I kind of hate the reductive nature of referring to Wilds as Monster Hunter World 2. It's just not. But secondly, the team seem more focused than ever on threading a strong story and thematic line through the game, and that means focusing on a smaller roster of monsters that tie in more strongly to the story ideas and dominant motifs. And they're also taking this chance to do things they tried but failed to do in World. They're going back to some old ideas to make them work properly this time. Things like Leviathans. Lagiacrus, or possibly Lagiacrus, depending on who you listen to, a heavy fan favorite monster, was very famously shown off in one of the earliest technical demos from the World dev team. But in the end, they had way too much trouble implementing him, because Monster Hunter World had vastly higher fidelity and complexity of environments that meant the slithering, belly-scraping nature of the Leviathans wound up causing all kinds of animation issues and geometry clipping. So the Lagiacrus and all the other Leviathans were left out completely. But now, with Wilds, they're taking another stab at getting Leviathans working properly in a modern game. And from what we've already seen for ourselves with Balahara in the first beta, they've got it working really quite nicely now. The way Balahara moves in the environment, uses the environment, crawls around and scampers and twists around the environment, it looks fantastic. And with the likes of Lalabarina, they're doing the same kind of thing for spider-like monsters, and I'm guessing crab-like monsters too, where both were completely missing from World, but present in Rise. So clearly they now have this style of monster working the way they wanted, with Wild's even higher geographical and environmental complexities as well. So while the roster may be comparatively small, the variety we're getting is much larger than World. And that kind of stuff takes a lot of work. I don't know about you, but I would rather have a roster of, 36 really finely tuned monsters of a good variety of kinds of fights, of kinds of monsters, of kinds of movements and behaviors. I will take that any day over, 50 or 60 monsters using heavy asset repurposing from old games, causing jank and other distractions, or just monsters that are reskins and stuff. Monster Hunter 4, also by the so-called mainline dev team, had 52 large monsters, but only 11 of them were actually new. The rest were reused ones, and many were not much more than reskins of others with slight animation and behavioral changes. Wild World had a much larger percentage of truly new monsters, and even the returning ones were fully reworked, although it did also have its share of reskins. How many different kinds of Rathian and Rathalos would you like to fight today? And it was the same with Rise. A lot more new monsters, and the returning ones were noticeably overhauled. And we got that monster variety back, with spiders and with Sunbreak, crabs making a return. These days, it's not enough just to design a monster and give it one of the standard rigs and set it up with animations and let it go in what is essentially a flat environment, or even a layered but still flat arena zone style areas. The newer games have so much more going on environmentally alone that you have to account for during a fight. And that's not even counting the stuff like idle behaviors and sleeping and eating and drinking, interacting with other monsters. All in service of making the immersion better and the world more believable and natural. And of course, all that work is just the monsters alone. Never mind the work it takes for each one to have up to 14 individual weapon designs and armor designs in both masculine and feminine styles, all in vastly higher fidelity than the old games ever needed. So yeah, you won't catch me whining about the roster being quote-unquote too small, even if we do just get, 32 monsters. I'd rather have all of those developer person-hours spent on making a deeply refined experience and making it as good as possible, rather than having the proverbial inch-deep ocean to splash my toes around in. Plus, of course, the launch roster is hardly the be-all and end-all these days. Free title updates add chunks of new monsters and new content, plus whatever new hunts, event quests, special investigations, seasonal events, and similar gimmicks that get added in smaller but very regular updates as we go along as well. And whatever the inevitable endgame gimmick to chunk up the existing monster roster in new and challenging ways will be, like we've seen with Frenzied and Apex monsters, and Tempered and Arch-Tempered and Curio-Afflicted and Risen monsters recently. And that, by the way, is one of the things I've personally had slightly spoiled by an accidental exposure to data mined information. I'm not going to say a damn thing here. Of course I'm not. I don't tend to talk about the data mined leaky stuff. And I will be deleting any and all comments that try to spoil it for anyone else, by the way, so please don't. Just respect your other hunters. But suffice to say, what I do know about the endgame gimmick does seem interesting, and I look forward to seeing how it works. So yeah, end of day, my money's on 32 monsters at launch, with, let's say 6, maybe 9 additional monsters over 3 title updates within the first year. That, by the way, is based on 0 information at all, just, vibes and guessing. My only point is, it will keep growing for at least 2 years worth of content and expansions. And boy, oh boy, am I looking forward to it. Thanks for watching. I am Lonty. I will catch you next time, and thank you as always to the patrons.